Hello and welcome to another episode in the Business Ready for Sale podcast series. This episode is going to be a little bit different in that this one was taken from a webinar or a web meeting that I do on a monthly basis for my Business Owners Taking Action mentoring group members. Although the podcast series is called Business Ready for Sale, as you know by now, a business that's ready for sale is well worth keeping. So a lot of what I do and a lot of the topics that I cover are about having a really great business and one that once you've got it ready for sale, you may actually want to keep it forever. So as I say, this episode is from a web meeting. So there's some interaction in there from members and questions, and it's a presentation by a friend of mine called Mike House. I do an intro of Mike at the start of the web meeting, but Mike is a survival expert, and my reason for having him meet with my members online was because this is during the COVID pandemic and a time when we couldn't get out and meet people face to face, and businesses had been sideswiped into something that most business owners, in fact I suspect all business owners of our generation, had never been involved in before. Mike House is not only a survival expert in the real terms of out there in the bush and in the wild, but he's also a great business person, and he relates his learning in the survival world to how to adapt businesses and get businesses going, particularly when under pressure, under pump, or facing massive change as we all have been in this last 12 months or so. So I hope you enjoy it. And Mike has written a book called Thrive and Adapt, which came out at a very appropriate time. So that's something well worth picking up and reading if you can. So now over to the webinar and my introduction, and let's listen to Mike. I've known Mike for many years now through National Speakers Association, which is now Professional Speakers Association in this country. And Mike's a really fascinating guy because he does some, what I think are crazy things. And he's one of those guys who, the more you get to know him, the more fascinating things you find out about him. So I'm going to read from something that I copied off Mike's website. So it says, Mike has survived several life-threatening survival situations on the ocean, in tropical jungles, in raging white water, and extended sea kayak journeys. Must be a very unlucky guy. As a birthday present to himself, Mike undertook a 12-day solo survival walk in one of Australia's most hostile environments, taking 2 litres of water, a pocket-sized survival kit, and the clothes on his back. Mike put his survival skills to the test, sourcing all his food and water off the land, and loved the experience. As I said, Mike's a bit different. It's not the kind of birthday present I would particularly give myself. So, Mike, it's over to you, and you're in control now.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for joining us on the call. I like the way that you're still describing this as lunch and learn, John. I want to know where my lunch is. It hasn't arrived yet.
Oh, that BYO, didn't I tell you that?
It's a bit of a different experience at the moment, and but it's still great to connect with people, and I've been enjoying the virtual interface over these last few weeks, getting a bit of useful stuff into people's pockets. So what I might do is just quickly jump into a share screen, and we can give you a bit of context and background for that intro from John. Let me just share the right screen, otherwise it's going to be still unuseful. And so John mentioned that he likes some of the crazy stuff that I do, or perhaps likes it from a distance. So this is an image taken from one of the survival courses that we used to run. The peak survival experience course that we used to run was a 10-day program in the Pilbara. That's a bit of the Pilbara there. For people who aren't familiar with Western Australia, it's an arid region about 1,800 k's north of our capital city, Perth, and it's pretty hostile. It can get out to in excess of. Are you guys getting that notification popping up on your screen? Just out of interest.
Nope.
No, good, thank you. It can be pretty hostile during the summertime. It can get up to in excess of 50 degrees Celsius. And we used to take people for a 10-day walk, basically the equivalent of what I did for that solo trip. So it was all a bit like Bear Grylls, only real. And some of the issues with Bear, he gives people interesting and dodgy advice that is entertaining for TV, but not necessarily much chop for survival. So one of his pieces of advice is you should drink your own wee to stay hydrated. And as a survival specialist, I thought it was probably worth finding out whether there was any legitimacy to that. To be honest, I wasn't too keen on the idea of field trials. I thought I'd just ask people who knew. And I spoke to medical friends of mine and said, what's your take on this idea? And universally, they said, Mike, it's a dumb idea. It's toxins out of your body. And if you're putting that back in the top when you're already dehydrated, the results aren't going to be good. And a good mate of mine who's a doctor said, in fact, you'd be better off drinking someone else's. And I don't know about you, but that didn't raise the appeal of the experiment in my mind at all. But it did get me thinking a bit about survival kits. Teabag is often an inclusion in a survival kit. I thought maybe that's why. Perhaps it's a bit early for that piece of humour between us, but you never know. One bag of sugar. Do you want sugar with that? So that was an experience that we would take people on. And normally by the time I've said a little bit about that, it divides the audience roughly into thirds. So there's a third of you who are probably going, fantastic. As soon as isolation is over, I'd love to sign up for an experience like that. There's probably a third of you who are going, just never let me anywhere near the bush with this lunatic. Keep me as far from him as possible. And there's probably about a third of you who are going, well, what's that got to do with us in our world of business and life and work? Because I'm never likely to get myself in the kind of situation where I'm lost or stranded in the outback. So what I want to do this morning is just unpack, or this afternoon, is just unpack a few pieces of universally applicable wisdom from the world of survival. And there's some really interesting intersections, I think, between that world and the world of business. And the first observation that I made, sitting on rocks out there, I kind of conceived of and wrote this book, Thrive and Adapt. And it's essentially a set of tools for people under pressure, individually and to a small degree collectively. So the first observation in that is that there's circumstances that we face and there's the response that we have to them. And if you've been on the planet and with your eyes open for any amount of time, you know that the circumstances don't drive the response. And we're seeing that on steroids at the moment, as we face a situation that's had probably for the first time in our living memory, a genuine and tangible impact on literally every single person on the planet. And it's rare that we, in a set of circumstances like that, we often face challenge individually or as a family or as a business. It's a pretty much 1 in 100 year kind of event where globally we face that. And you can see in this circumstance, there's some people who are looking at opportunity. There's some people that are in an absolute tailspin going, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. Some of that depends on how well they're equipped to handle short-term duress. So, your state of finances, the state of your family, the state of your house, the state of your work, the likely future of that all has an impact, of course. And if you're directly sick or dying as a result of this disease, well, that's a whole other level of impact. But you can clearly see this distinction between the circumstances we face and people's response. And there's a fascinating area of research in psychology. This book's probably the best summary of it. It's called The Survivor Personality by a guy called Al Siebert. And he started this piece of thinking, which was to look at people under duress across a whole range of circumstances. So they examined medical situations where people had been given really dire medical diagnoses. They looked at prisoners of war. They looked at people lost or stranded in the outback. They looked at relationship breakdowns. They looked at business failures. And they said there's a group of people across this range of human experiences where our backs are to the wall that outperform the crowd. They do better than the average. And they seem to almost have an uncanny ability to stack the deck in their favour when they're under duress. So he got fascinated about that. What's the traits that show up in those people? And I'd like to share a few of those with you today. I'd preface this with, broadly fits into the realm of psychology and resilience and well-being. And I'd preface some of this with saying that a few organisations have come to me over this period and said, can you help us build resilience in our organisation? And that's a bit like grabbing a battery-powered drill where you've got to drill one hole and the battery's flat. It ain't going to work. You've got to charge the battery first. Trying to build resilience in the midst of crisis is a very, very difficult thing to do. And in fact, it probably compounds the stress that people are already facing because it adds over the top of whatever the circumstantial stress is, an element of stress about I should be able to deal with this better than I am. And, it's a bit like a bank. You kind of need to have the battery charged before you need it. That said, if you're reasonably resilient already, either as an individual, a family or an organisation, times of trial can actually enhance our resilience because it's an opportunity to test it. A bit like courage. We don't get to test resilience until our back's to the wall. We don't need it when we're just ticking along business as usual, well within our comfort zone. It's only when something very unpredictable and disruptive comes along that resilience gets tested. So with that preface, here's a few traits that universally exist across those people that do better against the odds. So one is a thing called the Stockdale paradox. Jim Collins wrote about this in his book, Good to Great. Stockdale was a high-ranking US military person who was shot down over Vietnam early in the Vietnam War, and he was incarcerated in the notorious prisoner of war camp, the Hanoi Hilton, for 8 years. Subject to many, many incidents of torture over that period of time, and saw many of his comrades, both American and Australian, suffer and die in that place. He came out of it significantly more robust than he went in. And Siebert researches that kind of phenomena. How come some people break and others emerge stronger? And Collins interviewed Stockdale at length for Good to Great. And he said, what's this thing that meant that you could get out of a very, very physically definitely damaging and potentially mentally damaging experience stronger than you went in? And Stockdale says it's an unwavering faith that you'll prevail in the end. And Collins, on reflection on that, said, okay, so who didn't make it? And Stockdale says, it's easy. It's the optimists that don't make it. And Collins describes this moment of discombobulation as he heard that. It's like, what's going on here? You seem to have just said you've got to be optimistic, and now you're saying the optimists didn't make it. And when Stockdale explained it, he said, the issue is if you're unrealistically optimistic, and that was around people putting defined dates on when this would end. So the people who said, we'll be out of here by Christmas would come and Christmas would go, and then they'd go, we'll be out of here by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go. And then they'd say, by Fred's birthday then, and that would come and go. And then they'd say, by Thanksgiving and then by Christmas. And each of those milestones would pass. And with each one, there was an erosion of hope. And Stockdale says they literally died of a broken heart. Like they've become hopeless in that situation. And Colin stops him at that point and says, well, hang on a minute. I'm not understanding. And I'll read a quote directly because it's just a cracker. He says, what's this? You know, you seem to be saying the optimists survive, and on the other hand, you're not. And Stockdale said to him, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end. And Stockdale went to the point of actually saying, I will come out of this stronger. He set that as an intention. His intention was to make it a life-defining moment or series of experiences. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. So there's this thing in the survivor personality where people don't sugarcoat what they're facing at all. There's no sense of, la, 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 this doesn't apply to me. There's no attempt at artificially putting dates or times or constraints or expectations around the things that you can't control. But so very realistically facing the circumstance while at the same time holding very firmly this faith that will prevail in the end. And Stockdale even goes to the extent of saying, even if that just means we have to die to get out of here, eventually we get out of here. So it's kind of brutal, that version of reality. But it's a really magical thing that people do to face and confront fully the circumstances they're in. So the way I'm seeing this show up, particularly over the last week or two in the situation that they're currently in, is, you know, we're still dealing with a whole heap of uncertainty. You know, even the world's leading medical modelers are still saying we don't really have enough data yet about how this is transmitted, about infection rates and recovery rates and death rates and all of that to reliably model COVID-19. So if the best of the best in their businesses are saying that, then us saying, oh, it'll be done by insert X time, we're deluding ourselves. We're fooling ourselves. The very real situation is that we don't know. We don't know. And there's layers of what we don't know. So when will the government start to ease restrictions? We're getting some inklings of that. There's some clues about that, but the reality is we don't know. When will the medical part of this situation be behind us globally? We don't know. When will there be a vaccine? We don't know. When will the economy start to recover? When will we pay for some of the things that we're currently drawing on the bank for, you know, JobKeeper and things like that? How will we pay for them? We don't know. So there's a power in acknowledging what we don't know and then saying, okay, so what's within my control and what can I do about that? So I'd just like to... I'll go back to share screen. So this is the second piece, I guess. First is face the reality and hold this unwavering certainty. The second is to deal with the things that are within your ability to control. So I'm just going to hop back to a share screen here and just call up a blank one that we can draw on. Okay, you should have a white... Whoop.
We do.
And why are you not letting me draw on that? Just hang to. Here we go. Now we can sketch. So this was first talked about in a really cohesive way in Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But it doesn't originate from him. The thinking actually goes way, way back to the Stoics, ancient Greece and Rome. And looking at the domains that we have to pay attention to if we want to live successfully. So the first domain is this inner circle, the things that we have control over. So this is a great tool for triage. We mentioned that in the title of this particular session. So what can you control directly in the set of circumstances that you face, where you pull a lever and you know you're going to get a result. So you can divide that into work and personal. And I think, in the personal arena, it's things like I know I can get good sleep. I can look after myself from a nutrition point of view. I can keep exercising. I can look after my mental health and well-being via whatever tools I use for that. I can check and notice and adjust my attitude where I need to. They're all things that are within my control. As soon as I start trying to put dates and times and things on how long this will last, I'm actually attempting to control things that are actually outside my control. The next circle out is the circle of influence. So this is, it's like control, but it's a bit more vague. So if I want John to do something, I can't directly control him, but I can have conversations with him. So we see this show up in delegation, when we're agreeing on principles or something. I can go, John, I'd like you to ask me this kind of question or introduce me in this kind of way. And John might do it or he might not. I don't directly control that. So we experience a heap of stress when we confuse that line between the two. If I feel like I should be able to control John and I have some expectation of that, or I feel like I should be able to control when this situation ends and I'm trying to play in that space, or I'm a perfectionist where I'm trying to make sure everything's polished to within an inch of its life, I will experience a heap of stress because I'm basically trying to control things that are outside of my direct control. And then the last circle here is the circle of concern. And that's things that we should be paying attention to. So, for me at the moment, the circle of concern includes keeping a rough eye on how this thing is progressing, because I want to be aware of how it's moving, how it's changing, what the potential opportunities and threats are, both for me individually, but also for my business and my family. But I can't control or influence any of that. It's a bit like a storm coming in off the coast. If I'm out there in survival mode, then I need to know the storm's coming. What's in my control is finding shelter, staying warm, those kinds of things, but I'm not going to stop the storm. So it's being very, very clear about that distinction. As a model, I find it simultaneously liberating and a little bit scary, because usually the stuff that's directly within our control is a fairly small bucket. If we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, a really great thing to do is just get right into that central circle and only play there. The influence one we can look at as a choice. So what do I need to influence who? And because I recognize that I haven't got direct control over it, I can actually pick appropriate tactics for that. And, we could talk for an hour just purely about that, and maybe that's a topic for another day. So that's a massive piece of the territory. So for me, one of the big control, and it has a massive impact on headspace, is the flow of information. So it's been, ever since this thing started, a little bit like a fire hydrant with the lid ripped off. There is plenty of data, there's plenty of news, there's plenty of artificial stuff that's completely not real. There's plenty of stuff being passed on because it sounds good and gives an artificial sense of certainty. There's plenty of people really worried about what the big orange man in America is saying. There's all sorts of stuff that we can tap in, and if we strap ourselves into the news cycle too heavily, that'll do our head in. So for me, I'm very conscious about how and where I get my news, and also doing some stuff behind the scenes to confirm its validity. There's a bucket of research that says, and this is for the everyday situation, not specific to now, but I think it would have a multiplying effect right now, that says, the more news we watch, the more likely we are to describe our day as a bad day. It has a very direct and real impact on our existence. But obviously we need to be aware of what's happening around us. It's not a case of cutting ourselves off from that or denying that the situation that we're in is a genuine and real situation. So that's point 2, is that control what you can control. And the third thing that I'd like to share with you that, again, is part of this survivor personality is it's a response to a thing called negativity bias, which is hardwired into humans. So negativity bias is our propensity to give greater weight to negative experiences than to positive ones. And there's various bits of research around that say, the ratio of how much weight a negative experience has compared to a positive one, it's anything from 3 to 1 all the way up to 11 to 1. I don't think the ratio is all that important. It's just what is important is recognizing that we skew it. So one of the most profound things that we can do, so how this shows up, of course, is that we look at the problems that are yet to be solved, the issues that we're facing, and they play on our mind. And that's actually been a survival strategy for humans. And it's been one of the things that's driven our evolution over the years, is that we have that propensity. We don't ignore the difficult stuff that's around us, and we get active in trying to fix it or lend some sort of progress to it. The challenge is it can also, particularly in a modern context, make us feel like we're not making any progress because we're noticing the big and negative stuff more than we're noticing the positive stuff. And the most simple strategy to balance this, and it's a trait of the survivor personality, is that we build gratitude into the day. Gratitude's been shown to have a profound effect on our mental well-being and all sorts of other measures that have a direct impact on bottom line as well, such as creativity, problem solving, ability to handle conflict, resilience, and there's all sorts of positive impacts of that. So I think particularly in times like this, it's really relevant it's relevant any time, but particularly under times of deep duress, it's highly relevant to build some sort of practice of gratitude and to build that into our personal and our business lives. And that can be as simple as just saying thank you to people around you and acknowledging the efforts that people are making. And especially when you notice yourself feeling a bit reactive or judgy about that. And the research around this says it doesn't really matter whether what we pay attention to from a gratitude point of view is large or small. So I could be grateful that I'm not in a country that's being significantly impacted by COVID-19, or I could be grateful that my wife went and bought me a coffee this morning on her way home from a walk. The magnitude of those things is very different, but the impact on my personal psychology turns out to be about the same. So we can find small things that we're genuinely grateful for. And, that's people like Stockdale, where we started. That's one of the things that they routinely do. His experience as a prisoner of war, he's saying, I'm grateful for this piece of torment that I'm currently experiencing because it will make me stronger and a better human being on the other side of it. I reckon if people like him can find gratitude under that sort of duress, then people in downtown Australia have got plenty of stuff to choose from. John, I reckon that'll do us for content. Let me stop the screen share. Let's maybe open it up to a bit of discussion and Q&A around what we've talked about. People want more detail or more information about any of that, now is your chance.
It's an interesting fine line, isn't it, between the optimism and the, we'll come through this sort of thing. I find that really interesting, and the point that Stockdale made about unrealistic optimism.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I see that in some people, and it explains a lot, actually. I hadn't thought about it like that before because I like optimistic people.
Yes.
But at the same time, you got to be realistic.
Yes.
And sometimes I get criticized for being pessimistic because I present the facts.
Yes. Yeah.
And then I get criticized because, you're not looking on the bright side.
Yeah. So it's interesting that whole territory of research says people who just look on the bright side it's almost like a rose-coloured glasses kind of thing. If you're just kind of in that territory of blindly optimistic, it's potentially a very slippery road. And I'm seeing it a lot in the community at the moment around this particular situation. And you're starting to hear people, for want of certainty and for want of positivity, saying, oh, yep, we'll hit this point and then we'll start to recover. And I've heard lots of versions of that. Examples are, well, Morrison put end of October on the stimulus packages, so by the end of October, this will all be over. It's like, well, it might or it might not. We actually don't know. And it's a very different thing to dive into that as a possible scenario and to consider and plan what we would do if that turned out to be true, to holding it as a kind of a flag for some sort of positivity and certainty. That's a much more dangerous piece of territory.
Yeah, interesting. Anyone else got a question for Mike about drinking urine or anything like that? I mean,
don't do it.
Questions are
Don't do it. It's a dumb idea.
I don't have a question, but I've got an observation. Like, one of the things that we are saying here on Rottnest is that we feel that our role in this crisis is just to be grateful. And the whole community is saying that because, we feel like, there's only 100 people here. We know we're safe. We're geographically isolated. We're actually pretty much having a fairly good time. And it's like, but what we're saying is that, rather than feel guilty, we need to just feel really grateful. And I think that's, it resonates what you said.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think your point there about feeling guilty is a fairly key one. There's all sorts of ways that the psychology of this stuff can play out, and I think we're going to see some of that now that we're in the more sort of less acute and more drawn out phase of this thing. And guilt is one of them. So, if I'm in a position where I've got a job and I'm feeling relatively comfortable, there's that sort of element of potential survivor's guilt where it's like, oh, there's a heap of other people that have been really negatively impacted. I should feel differently about what I've got than how I do. And again, that's a bit of a slippery road. So one of the fundamental principles that we taught in survival is you are where you are, deal with it. You can't be anywhere else on the road, and other people's experience and journey will be different. And yeah, gratitude is a fantastic way to moderate some of that stuff. The challenge is on the days where we feel most assaulted for whatever reason. And, I've had a few of these over the last couple of weeks where you look at the notion of gratitude and your tendency is to go, there's nothing I'm grateful for. And just somebody telling you this is one of the reasons why trying to build this stuff mid-crisis is really difficult. It just feels so patronizing and superficial if you don't already have this kind of built in as a bit of a routine in your life. For someone to come along while you're in the middle of a meltdown and go, you just need to be a bit more grateful, mate, and then you'll be right. Doesn't sort of sit well. It's not the time to build that muscle or that habit. But if you've got it, hang on to it. It's a real life raft when things get turbulent.
Okay. Anyone else got a comment or question for Mike?
I've got a comment. This situation has forced me to sort of start doing things in my business that I probably would have procrastinated a bit more, like getting my website up and running and get the CRM going, start doing my marketing, because I was sort of being too complacent about business coming in. Now I'm about to sort of really get moving quickly on things. So it's a positive for me in a way, sort of get me into survival mode and say, well, okay, what else can I do? And I've been booking my business a bit more, and sort of saying, well, what else can I do to get my business going better? And so that's what positive things I've been looking at. And when I look at the news, I think, okay, well, look at how other countries have been suffering, and I think, well, how lucky we are, and I am grateful for that. So, yeah, it makes me feel a whole lot better that we're in a country that's so, well, blessed in a way. It's just so that we are isolated in a way, and we can cope, and we're hopefully, if everybody adhering to the restrictions, we'll be coming out of this world quite well. So it's all good, positive stuff now.
I think those couple of examples you give there, Stephen, of getting into your website and a few other things in the business, you know, they're great examples of stuff in that circle of control. So we're facing this. What can I do about it is a very powerful question. We see people who are not so good at the game of resilience. There's a real strong tendency to head towards anger, blame, fear. And I think if we're honest, any of us experience those things in varying degrees at varying moments. The people who are good at this stuff are able to recognize it, compartmentalize it, and or deal with it, depending on how large it is, and move on into that territory of, okay, what can I control, and let me now take massive action on that very, very quickly. So I think a skill set we can practice and build, and it really is a lifetime of practice and building, in my view, is noticing that stuff, you know, the fear, blame, ego, anger, as it shows up, and get very, very good at working it through and or compartmentalizing it, depending on the length of play, and then just shifting into control and action.
Yeah, it's interesting, the pressure thing. Many years ago, when I did a whole lot of courses and workshops with Robert Kiyosaki before he became famous, he used to put us, I don't think he'd get away with doing it these days, but in the workshops, he used to put us under a heck of a lot of pressure. In fact, it became so, it ended up on four corners. One of his workshops ended up on four corners. In a very negative way. But anyway, he put us under pressure, and his sort of premise was that when you put things under pressure, they change. So if you want change, and he used the example of coal, he said, if you put enough pressure on coal, you end up with diamonds.
Yeah.
You know, because it's all carbon. But without the pressure, you don't get the diamonds. And so there was quite a whole lot of things around that. And I think from this, what we're going through at the moment, it's going to improve a lot of businesses. I mean, it's going to change things. It's going to hopefully improve a lot of things. But yes, there's going to be some collateral damage on the way through as well. But as you said, there are some things we can't control, and so we shouldn't.
It's interesting, that example, John, you know, and there's many from the current situation as well. I spoke to somebody last week who had been working on a 6-month implementation plan for an IT strategy in a global business, and they executed it in 2 days when this thing hit. Yeah, that's interesting. And you know, she said it's not well executed. There are holes, and there will be things that we have to kind of patch as we go. But kind of curious that we thought that before we were planning for it to take 6 months, and we thought that was an ambitiously quick time frame. And the pressure has meant we've been able to do it in 2 days. One of the challenges for us, I think, as we move into a more recovery-focused mode, will be, we won't be able to hold the expectation of speed of response that we've had in this immediate piece. There will be fatigue, there will be fractures, and, you know, if we're responsible for teams, part of our job will be actually bringing them back together and getting them into a state where they're feeling strong and aligned and capable again. But I think if we don't acknowledge that fatigue, and we try to use some of the experience of this sort of acute phase as too much of a lever, we'll break things. And that'll be a kind of delicate balancing act, you know, taking the learnings and the speed and capability that we've demonstrated to ourselves, and carrying some of that forward into whatever the new normal looks like, without expecting us to sustain a level of acute crisis response.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting times coming out of it. Mike, thank
Sure
you
is.
for your time and your insights and tips. How can people get in contact with you or find out more about what you do?
So my website, mikehouse.com.au, is always a good spot. And I'm more than happy to take emails from people at mike@mikehouse.com.au. If you're interested, we're doing every Wednesday, 2 p.m. Perth time for the foreseeable future. We're doing about a 40-minute session on tools, tactics and tips for dealing with the current situation we're in. So feel free to sign up for that and join us live for those calls, or catch the recordings as we load them up.
Yep, and I've been on some of those and they're excellent. You've had some great people on there, and the book.
Yes, Thrive and Adapt. So that's tips, tactics and tools for leading and dealing with stress and pressure. And that's available through the website as well.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to wrap up in what I do with my mentoring groups for business owners and business ready for sale workshops. You can find on johndenton.com.au. So very easy website URLs, aren't they, Mike?
Yeah.
And the email is john@johndenton.com.au. So thank you, everybody, for being here and contributing. And as I say, this will be available on YouTube and podcast very soon. I hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it. Very timely session from Mike. The things that stood out for me were Mike's circles, his circle of control, influence and concern, and facing reality and dealing with the things that you're in control of. Obviously work on things that you can influence as well, and with the outer circle, the circle of concern, then obviously you need to pay attention to it, be aware of what's going on, do a bit of scenario planning maybe. I can help you with that if you want. And yeah, be aware of any opportunities that come up as well. As I said at the beginning, this was a recording from a Zoom web meeting that I have once a month with my Business Owners Taking Action mentoring group. If you'd like to know more about my mentoring groups and web meetings and memberships, then you can find out at johndenton.com.au. Until the next episode of Business Ready for Sale podcast, bye and see you then.